Please don't leave. The little black girl cried to the biker as a locked door slammed behind the fuel depot. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The fuel depot stood silent under the weight of the moonlit sky. The distant hum of trucks passing by on the highway barely broke the stillness, but something was off tonight. A small figure darted through the shadows, her breaths ragged as she ran. A little black girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, stumbled toward the biker gang gathered near the depot's entrance. Her eyes wide with fear, she didn't even pause before running directly into one of the men, her tiny hands clutching at his leather vest. Please don't leave, she cried, her voice trembling. They're coming. They'll take me. The bikers froze, their hands momentarily still on their bikes. The roar of the engines, the clink of leather jackets, and the smell of gasoline all seemed to fade as their attention turned to the little girl. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. She looked up at the man she had grabbed onto, her eyes filled with panic. He was older, his face weathered by years of hard rides and even harder life. His tattoos, rough and proud, marked a past that had taught him never to ignore a call for help. The girl's words hit him like a slap to the face. Please, you have to help me, she sobbed. He's coming. My uncle. He said he was going to hurt me if I didn't go back. The man's gaze shifted to the others, a silent understanding passing between them. These weren't just men with tattoos and leather jackets. These were men who lived by a code, a promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The group moved as one, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense with the kind of focus that came from years of facing down danger. They didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. They'd been called to action before, but never like this. The girl tugged at the biker's sleeve, dragging him closer. He's a bad man, she whispered. He hurts people. The biker bent down, bringing himself to her level, his face softening for a moment. Don't worry, kid, he said quietly. You're safe now. But just as he spoke, a loud slam echoed through the night. The door to the depot slammed shut behind them. The sound of a car engine revved, followed by the screeching of tires against asphalt. The little girl flinched, her grip tightening around the biker's vest. He's here, she whimpered. Please, don't leave me. The man nodded to his crew, signaling them to move out. He was no stranger to danger, but something about the way this girl clung to him sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't let her go, not now. Not when it was clear her life was in immediate danger. He stood up straight, locking eyes with his crew. They were ready. They were always ready. But this time, it wasn't just another fight. This time, it was personal. We're getting her out of here, he said with firm resolve. Nobody's going to touch her while we're still breathing. The engines of the bikes roared to life, filling the night air with a thunderous sound as the group began to move toward the exit of the fuel depot. The little girl, still clinging to the biker, looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. Thank you, she whispered. As they made their way out, the night seemed to grow colder, the stakes higher. The bikers knew what they had to do, and they weren't going to stop until they had protected the girl. What lay ahead was unclear, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. Ignoring the roar of the engines, the group of bikers sped down the empty highway, the sound of their motorcycles echoing through the night. The air was thick with tension, and the urgency of the situation hung heavy. The little girl, still clutching the biker's leather vest, kept her eyes darting nervously to the side, every shadow seeming to hold a new threat. Her face, streaked with tears, showed a mix of relief and lingering fear. The man riding with her, the one she had turned to for help, was focused on the road ahead, his grip tight on the handlebars. He had promised her father, years ago, that he would protect her. He wasn't about to break that promise now. Ignoring the sound of the SUV's engine fading into the distance, the bikers kept a watchful eye on the road, their engines idling in the cool night air. The girl, Maya, still clung to the biker's back as they made their way toward the safe house. The tension in the air hadn't lifted completely, but the worst was over, for now. The convoy of motorcycles, a sea of leather and steel, snaked down the quiet road as they approached a small, secluded cabin. The bikers had set up this location as a temporary refuge, far from the prying eyes of the town and the authorities. It was a place to regroup, to wait, and to protect Maya from the looming danger. As they rolled up to the cabin, the doors opened, and the rest of the crew began unloading their gear. The cabin was simple, tucked away in the woods with a large porch and a few lights flickering in the distance. Maya's eyes darted around, taking in her new surroundings, but she said nothing. She was exhausted. Every step she had taken since the moment she ran from her uncle felt like a small victory, but it had been a long night. Her small frame, still trembling from fear and adrenaline, slowly slid off the biker's bike. The cold night air seemed to bring her back to her senses, but only just. The biker, who had carried her away from the nightmare, looked down at her with a quiet resolve. "You're safe now, Maya," he said, his voice steady despite the weariness he felt. She nodded, her face still streaked with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man gave her a reassuring smile, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He turned to his crew. "Let's get her inside and settled. We'll keep watch through the night. No one gets in or out without us knowing." The bikers quickly moved into action, securing the area around the cabin. They had been through enough dangerous situations to know how to handle this, but that didn't mean they were taking any chances. The bikers had learned long ago that the world wasn't kind to those who couldn't defend themselves, and they were more than willing to step in whenever necessary. The crew had settled in, some standing guard outside, others inside, watching over Maya. The night passed slowly, with the crackling of a fire in the corner of the cabin and the soft murmurs of the crew as they discussed their next move. Maya was resting on a couch by the fire, her small body curled up under a blanket. The biker who had been her protector all night sat across from her, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That man in the SUV, her uncle, he wasn't going to let this go. He had seen it too many times before. People who believed they were above the law, who felt entitled to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. It was a dangerous thing, and it made the biker's blood run cold. Maya had been through enough already. He wasn't about to let her face any more danger, not on his watch. The night dragged on, but as dawn approached, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. There was a calm before the storm. The bikers had done their best to keep everything in order, but now it was time to make a move. The biker, whose name was Forge, stood up from his chair and walked over to the window. He could see the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. He knew what had to be done. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice low but firm. The others in the room turned to him, their faces serious. "We need to get Maya somewhere safe. Somewhere she can stay hidden until this whole thing blows over." He turned back to look at Maya, who was still asleep. The sight of her, vulnerable and scared, struck him deeply. He had made a promise to her father, and he wasn't about to break it. "I'll take her to a place we have set up in the city," Forge said, his voice filled with determination. "It's off the grid. She'll be safe there." The bikers exchanged glances, knowing it wouldn't be an easy journey. "We'll go with you," one of them said, his voice resolute. "We stick together all the way." Forge nodded. "We move out at first light. Maya's not alone in this." As the crew began to prepare for the next stage of their journey, the weight of what they were about to do settled in. The safe house had been a temporary solution, but it was time to take the next step. Forge had no doubt that the uncle would be looking for Maya, and the longer they stayed in one place, the greater the chance he would find them. They needed to move fast and quietly, and they needed to keep Maya safe, no matter the cost. Just as they finished packing up, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared in the distance. Everyone froze, eyes darting toward the road. The tension was back, and it was worse than before. Was it her uncle? Had he tracked them down? Or was it just another vehicle passing by? Forge's heart raced. He motioned for the crew to stay quiet, and huddled close to the window. The sound grew louder, and just when it seemed like the engine would pass, the bike slowed down. Forge's eyes narrowed. This was it. Time to find out if they were about to face a confrontation, or if they could make it out of this alive. The next few minutes would decide everything. The sound of the motorcycle grew louder, and Forge's grip tightened on the windowsill. He motioned for the crew to stay still, holding his breath as the engine slowed down. Every second felt like an eternity as the sound came closer, then stopped. His eyes narrowed, scanning the road from the window, trying to make out the shape of the approaching vehicle. The tension in the air was thick. Was it the uncle coming for Maya? Or was it someone else? His mind raced, but Forge knew that whatever it was, they had to be ready. Stay quiet, Forge whispered, his voice low and steady. The crew nodded, their expressions grim. They had all been in tight spots before, but this felt different. Maya, still sleeping on the couch by the fire, was unaware of the danger approaching. Forge's heart sank at the thought of her being dragged back into that nightmare, but he pushed the fear aside. They had promised to protect her, and that's exactly what they would do. A loud knock on the door shattered the silence. Forge's hand shot to his gun, and the rest of the crew tensed, ready for anything. Another knock, this time harder, more urgent. "It's me," came a voice from outside. Forge's eyes flicked to the crew, who seemed just as confused as he was. They hadn't been expecting anyone, but there was something familiar about the voice. "Who is it?" Forge called, keeping his voice steady, though his pulse raced. "It's Rick," the voice answered. "Rick Coleman. Open up." Forge's heart skipped a beat. He had known Rick for years. Rick was the man whose daughter Maya had grown up with, the man who had asked Forge to look out for his family when he couldn't. "It's him," Forge said, lowering his gun and motioning to the others to stay back. He moved cautiously to the door, his eyes never leaving the crew as he reached for the handle. With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. Standing there in the dim light of the early morning was Rick Coleman, looking disheveled and out of breath. His clothes were torn, his face marked with cuts and bruises, and his eyes were wide with a mix of fear and determination. "Rick, what the hell happened to you?" Forge asked, his voice filled with concern. Rick glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for something, before stepping inside. "I've been looking for Maya," Rick said urgently, his voice shaky. "The bastard who's after her, he's not done. He's been threatening to come after her, and I had to make sure she was okay. I'm sorry, Forge, I had no choice." Rick's voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard. Forge stepped forward, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "You don't need to apologize, Rick. You're here now. We'll keep her safe. But you need to tell me everything, and fast. The longer we stay here, the more chances he has of finding us." Rick nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I couldn't leave her with him anymore. I couldn't let that man hurt her. I didn't know where else to go. I tried calling, I tried everything. But I was too late. He found out where I was. And when I tried to leave, they were waiting for me. I barely got away. I don't know how long we have, but we need to move, Forge. We can't stay here." Forge's heart was racing now. It wasn't just the uncle he had to worry about. Rick's words made it clear that there was something bigger going on, something they hadn't anticipated. Maya's uncle wasn't just an abusive man. He was part of a larger, more dangerous situation than they had realized. Rick was right. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. But where could they go? "We're not staying here," Forge said firmly. "We move at first light. I've got a safe place set up for her, but we need to keep moving. You're with us now, Rick. Whatever happens, we'll protect her together. You hear me?" Rick nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and guilt. "I don't deserve your help, but thank you, Forge. I just want to make sure she's safe." Forge gave him a reassuring nod, then turned to the crew. "Get everything packed up. We leave in 20 minutes. We stay together, no matter what." The crew moved quickly, their experience showing as they gathered their gear and prepared to leave. Forge looked back at Maya, still asleep on the couch. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had been through so much already. And now, it was clear, her fight was far from over. The bikers knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but they also knew they had a promise to keep. As Forge made his way to the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was coming. Whatever it was closer than they realized. It wasn't just the uncle they had to worry about. Someone bigger, someone more dangerous, was pulling the strings. But they weren't going to let that stop them. Not on their watch. They would fight for Maya, no matter what. The convoy of bikers gathered outside, ready to ride once more. The sun was starting to rise, casting a faint light over the quiet town. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would not stop until Maya was safe. And as the engines roared to life once more, Forge knew the fight was just beginning. The convoy of bikers moved quietly down the winding roads as the sun began to rise, casting long shadows over the empty highway. Forge rode at the front, his mind racing. The situation had grown even more dangerous than he had anticipated. Rick's appearance had added more urgency to their mission. The uncle wasn't just a troubled man. He was part of something larger. Forge knew that this wasn't going to be over easily. They couldn't just outrun him. They had to outsmart him. As the bikes rumbled down the road, the atmosphere was tense. The crew was focused, alert to every movement, every sound. No one spoke, but the weight of the situation was heavy in the air. Maya, still wrapped in the blanket Forge had given her, sat behind him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She had been quiet since they left the cabin, her body trembling slightly as she fought to stay awake. Forge could feel her fear, even though she tried to hide it. She had been through so much already. He needed to keep her safe. He had promised her father he would, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. The road ahead was unfamiliar, and Forge knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They were heading for a remote safe house deep in the woods, a place no one could easily find. It had been a long time since he had used it, but he knew it was the best option. They had to get there before anyone caught up with them. Rick, who had been riding beside them, was quiet, lost in his thoughts. Forge could tell he was still processing everything, his family, his past, the mistakes he had made. But now wasn't the time for reflection. Rick, Forge called over his shoulder, breaking the silence. You good back there? Rick nodded, his face grim. Yeah, just trying to figure out how I let it get this far. Forge didn't say anything. There was no point in offering comfort now. They had a job to do. A few miles ahead, the rest of the crew had started to pull off the main road, taking a narrow dirt path that led deeper into the woods. Forge signaled to the others to follow. As they made their way off the beaten path, the terrain became more treacherous. The dirt road was rough, with large rocks and deep ruts, but the bikers were used to it. They had ridden through worse. Maya clung tighter to Forge as they bumped along the path. The air was cool, and the forest around them seemed to close in, the trees tall and dense. Forge glanced back to check on her. You doing okay? He asked softly. She nodded but didn't say anything. Forge could see the fear in her eyes, though, and it hurt him more than he cared to admit. She had been through hell already, and now they were on the run again. They had no guarantees of safety, no guarantees that they wouldn't be found. The sound of engines ahead made Forge tense. They were approaching the safe house. They had to be careful. If anyone knew where they were going, it would all be over. The crew spread out, surrounding the area as they pulled into a clearing. The safe house was an old cabin, hidden deep in the woods, far away from any main roads. It was the perfect place to lay low, at least for now. The bikers dismounted, their boots crunching in the gravel as they moved toward the cabin. The door creaked as Forge opened it, revealing the dark interior. He motioned for Maya to come inside, but she hesitated for a moment, looking back toward the forest. Forge placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're safe now, he said gently. She nodded but still seemed uncertain. He led her inside, and the rest of the crew followed. The cabin was small, with only the basics, a few chairs, a small table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. It was perfect for what they needed, isolated and secure. As Forge shut the door behind them, he turned to Rick. Stay alert, he said quietly. We'll set up a perimeter, make sure no one gets in or out without us knowing. We need to rest, but we can't afford to get complacent. Rick nodded, his eyes scanning the room. I'll take first watch, he said. Forge didn't argue. The tension was palpable. The crew began to settle in, taking positions around the cabin, making sure everything was secure. Maya sat on one of the chairs, her small hands twisting in her lap. Forge could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She hadn't spoken much since they had left, but it was clear that she was still processing everything that had happened. The fear she had carried with her was still there, lurking beneath the surface. Forge walked over to her, crouching down so he was eye level with her. Maya, he said softly, I know this is scary, but you're going to be okay. We're going to make sure of it. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Will he come for me again? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Forge's heart tightened. He didn't want to lie to her. He might try, he said, his voice firm but gentle. But we won't let him. Maya nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. Forge stood up and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark woods. They had to be ready for anything. The uncle wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. But Forge was determined. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Maya. Not on his watch. The wind howled through the trees as the bikers stood guard around the cabin, their eyes scanning the darkened woods. It had been a few hours since they arrived, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every noise, every movement in the distance had his attention. He knew they were safe for now, but it wouldn't be long before her uncle came looking for her. Maya had finally fallen asleep, but Forge couldn't allow himself to rest. Not yet. Rick had settled into a chair near the fire, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He had been a good man, but there was a sense of guilt in his actions. He had left his daughter to protect her from a danger he should have seen coming. Forge knew that feeling too well. Sometimes you didn't realize the monster until it was already too late. Forge moved quietly across the room, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floorboards. The cabin had been abandoned for years, its walls worn and its structure weak, but it offered them the protection they needed for the moment. He stood in the corner, staring at the shadows cast by the dim light of the fire. His mind was running, thinking of the next steps. He had to move fast. They couldn't stay here forever. It was only a matter of time before her uncle realized where she was. Suddenly, a crackling sound echoed from the other side of the room. Forge immediately turned his head, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Rick stood up, his eyes wide. "What was that?" he whispered urgently. Forge motioned for everyone to stay quiet. He moved toward the door, his hand steady, trying to listen for anything that didn't belong. The night was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He could feel the tension rising. The bikers had trained for situations like this, when you didn't know who was coming or what they were bringing. But there was always that split second of doubt. It wasn't just her uncle they had to worry about anymore. There were bigger forces at play. A moment later, a sound broke through the silence, the crunch of tires on gravel. Forge froze. It was unmistakable. A car was coming. He signaled to the crew, and they immediately moved into position, taking their places around the cabin. Rick's face went pale. "They found us," he muttered under his breath. Forge's jaw tightened. He stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cold night air. He could hear the car coming closer, but it wasn't slowing down. Forge's instincts kicked in. It was too late to run. They were going to have to face this head-on. The bikers readied their bikes, preparing for whatever was coming. Forge walked back into the cabin, his mind already working out their next move. "Get Maya," he said to one of the bikers. "Keep her safe. We'll handle this." The biker nodded, moving quickly to do as ordered. Forge could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the woods. The others were positioned, their eyes locked on the driveway where the car was approaching. Forge's heart beat faster. The air felt charged with the tension of what was coming. The car pulled up to the cabin, its headlights illuminating the clearing. Forge's eyes narrowed as he stepped into the doorway, facing whoever had come. A man stepped out of the car, tall, well-dressed, and familiar. It was Maya's uncle, but something in his eyes had changed. They were no longer filled with anger, but with something colder, more calculating. He had clearly come prepared. "Forge," he said calmly, his voice cold as steel. "I know what you're trying to do, but you won't win." Forge stood his ground, his posture firm. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man smirked, taking a step forward. "You think you can stop me? You're just a bunch of bikers. You have no idea what you're dealing with." "You're wrong," Forge said, his voice low and steady. "We protect those who need it, and we won't let you hurt her." The tension in the air was palpable. It felt like the calm before the storm. The man's eyes flicked to the bikers behind Forge, who were already moving into position, their faces hard and determined. "This is bigger than you," the man said, his smirk fading into a more serious expression. "You think you're going to stop me? You're just delaying the inevitable." Forge stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "We're not here to delay anything. We're here to end it. You're not getting anywhere near her." The man's hand slid to his waist, where Forge could see the glint of a gun. The air was thick with tension. Forge wasn't going to let this man take Maya. Not now, not ever. The situation was rapidly escalating. Maya's uncle was desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. Forge could see it in his eyes, but he couldn't afford to underestimate him. The bikers were ready. They had faced down worse. But this time, it was personal. The uncle took another step forward, the gun now visible in his hand. Forge's heart pounded, but he kept his composure. One wrong move could make everything spiral out of control. But Forge wasn't about to back down. Not when it came to protecting a child. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Forge's gaze shot to the woods, where shadows were moving toward them. He wasn't alone, and neither was Maya's uncle. Something bigger was at play, and Forge wasn't about to let anyone else get hurt. The situation had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. The man with the gun took another step forward, his fingers tightening around the grip. The air was thick with tension, as if the whole forest around them was holding its breath. Forge didn't move an inch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked onto the uncle's face, watching every tiny shift of his body, every movement that could signal an attack. The bikers behind him were ready, their hands on their weapons, but no one made a move. The uncle was desperate, but Forge knew that desperation often led to mistakes. "You're not getting her," Forge said, his voice cold and firm. "This is over. Now." The uncle's face twisted in anger, but there was something else there too, fear. For the first time, he seemed to doubt his own conviction. He hadn't expected to be confronted like this. "You think you can just stop me? You think you can just ride in here and take what's mine?" His voice was low, but the threat was clear. Forge's heart beat steady. "You're wrong. She's not yours. She never was." The uncle took another step forward, his hand slowly inching towards his waistband. Forge's hand tightened on his own weapon. The uncle pulled the gun, aiming it at Forge, but he wasn't fast enough. In one fluid motion, Forge stepped to the side, pulling his gun from the holster and aiming it at the man. The standoff was brief, but it felt like an eternity. Neither of them moved. The uncle's chest heaved with frustration. His eyes flicked back toward the cabin, where Maya was still hidden inside. He knew that no matter what, he had to get to her. But Forge wasn't going to let that happen. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling the trees. "Get the hell out of here," Forge growled, his voice low and dangerous. The uncle glared at him, his hand shaking. But then, just as quickly as he had drawn the gun, he lowered it. He stared at Forge, the anger in his eyes slowly shifting to something darker. The uncle's jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he said, his voice seething with venom. He turned sharply, heading toward the car, but not before casting one last, lingering look at the cabin. Forge's finger remained on the trigger until the man was safely in the car, driving away with the dust kicking up behind him. Forge didn't relax until the car disappeared around the bend. It was only then that he exhaled, his body finally letting go of the tension that had been building. "We're not done," Forge muttered under his breath. The rest of the bikers remained tense, waiting for the signal. "Let's move," Forge ordered. "We're not staying here any longer than we need to." The crew quickly moved into action. They packed their gear and checked the perimeter one last time. They couldn't afford to stay in one place too long, not with Maya's uncle still out there. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that he would return with more men or worse, more firepower. As the crew prepared to leave, Rick approached Forge, his face drawn and exhausted. "What now?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Forge looked at him, his expression hardening. "We keep moving. We get Maya to a place where she's safe. A place where he can't find her." Rick nodded, but there was still a cloud of doubt hanging over him. Forge could see it in his eyes, the guilt, the fear. He didn't have the answers Rick was looking for, but he wasn't going to back down. "You're doing the right thing, Rick. We'll get her through this. She's not alone anymore." The group gathered around, their bikes roaring to life once again as they hit the road. Forge kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of pursuit. He knew the uncle would come back. He wasn't going to let this go. But Forge wasn't about to let anyone hurt Maya. Not again. As the convoy of bikes sped down the road, the morning sun broke through the trees, casting a golden light over the forest. It was a moment of peace, but it was fleeting. Forge knew they had a long way to go, a long road ahead, but they would keep moving. They would keep fighting. And when the time came, they would face whatever came next. Together, the convoy of bikers continued down the winding road, the early morning sun barely breaking through the thick trees surrounding them. Forge's mind raced as the wheels of his bike hummed beneath him. The tension from the standoff with Maya's uncle hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown heavier. He could still see the look in the man's eyes. This was far from over. It was just the beginning of something much bigger than they had anticipated. The group of bikers kept a steady pace, moving quickly yet cautiously. Forge glanced over his shoulder to check on Maya, who was riding behind him. She had finally fallen asleep, her small hands wrapped tightly around his waist, clutching him for comfort. Her face was peaceful for the moment, but he knew that the nightmares weren't over for her. It would take time for her to heal from everything she had been through. Forge couldn't imagine the fear she had carried for so long. She was just a child, yet she had already seen and felt things no one should have to endure. The crew had made a promise to keep her safe, and Forge intended to keep that promise. But he also knew that safety wasn't guaranteed. Maya's uncle wasn't the only threat they were facing, and time was running out. They had to find a way to get her to a place where she would be truly safe, out of reach of the dangers that were closing in on her. The road ahead was unknown. Every turn, every mile, was a risk. Forge's eyes scanned the horizon, keeping an eye on the surrounding landscape. His thoughts drifted back to Rick, who had been riding behind them. He could tell Rick was struggling. The guilt, the fear of what had happened, it was weighing on him. Forge had known Rick for a long time, and he knew that the man was a good person at heart, but the past had a way of catching up with you. Now, Rick was a part of this fight, and Forge wasn't about to let him fall apart when they needed to stay strong. Forge wasn't sure where they would go next, but he knew they couldn't stay on the move forever. They needed a plan. The bikes roared as they sped through a small town, the roads empty and quiet. It felt like the calm before the storm, a brief moment of peace before everything erupted. Forge's hand tightened around the throttle. He wasn't sure what was waiting for them ahead, but he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As the convoy approached a fork in the road, Forge signaled for the group to pull over. The bikers slowed, pulling off to the side of the road, their engines rumbling in the quiet morning. "We need to talk," Forge said, his voice steady. The group gathered around, their faces hard and determined. "We can't keep running like this," he continued. "We need a place to lay low, a place where Maya will be safe. But we also need to figure out who's pulling the strings behind all of this." The bikers exchanged looks, knowing that Forge was right. They had been reacting to everything so far, but now it was time to take control. "What do you suggest?" one of the bikers asked. "We need to find out who's really behind this," Forge said. "It's not just Maya's uncle. Someone is orchestrating all of this, and we need to find out who. We can't keep running forever." "What about Rick?" another biker asked. "He's a liability. His uncle's still after Maya. We're not safe as long as he's a target." Forge's jaw tightened, but he knew it was the truth. "We keep him close for now. We'll figure out what's next when we get somewhere safer." The crew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They were all in this together now. "All right, let's get moving," Forge said. "We've got a long road ahead." The bikers revved their engines, and the convoy set off once again, their sights set on a new destination. Forge knew that wherever they were headed, it was only a matter of time before the storm caught up with them. But they had to keep moving. There was no other choice. The road ahead stretched out before them, endless and uncertain, but Forge had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. Not now. Not ever. As they rode through the morning light, Forge felt the weight of what they were up against. Maya's uncle wasn't the only threat they faced, but he was the most immediate. Forge had to keep her safe, no matter what it took. And if that meant facing down every danger in their path, then so be it. He wasn't afraid. The bikers weren't afraid. They were a family, and they would fight to protect one of their own. The world could come crashing down around them, but they would stand strong. And they would fight for Maya. Wherever they were headed, Forge knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. This was about taking down the people who thought they could hurt the innocent. And Forge was ready to do whatever it took. The morning light had begun to fade as the convoy of bikers continued down the winding back roads, the rhythmic hum of their engines filling the air. Forge's mind was clouded with thoughts, but one thing was clear. They couldn't stay on the move forever. They had to find a place to regroup and plan their next steps. Maya, still wrapped in her blanket, had fallen asleep again, but her face remained tight with the kind of fear that couldn't be shaken off easily. Forge kept his focus on the road ahead, his knuckles gripping the handlebars, his thoughts as sharp as ever. He couldn't stop thinking about the uncle, about the dangers that lay ahead, and about what was happening to Maya. It was no longer just a fight for her survival. It was a fight for justice, a fight to put an end to whatever twisted web the uncle had gotten tangled in. The bikers hadn't slowed down, but Forge could sense that the tension among them had grown. They were all keeping their eyes open, their instincts on high alert. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, the landscape offering no real signs of civilization. They were deep in the heart of nowhere, and Forge knew that it was only a matter of time before they'd need to make a hard decision. Ahead, the road began to open up to a small town, nestled against the edge of a mountain. It wasn't much, but it was something. The crew had to stop for fuel and supplies, and Forge knew they needed to take a breath, even if just for a moment. He waved to the others to signal that they'd be stopping soon. As they pulled into a gas station, the usual morning calm of the small town was interrupted by the roar of motorcycle engines. The few people on the street turned their heads, eyeing the bikers with curiosity, but Forge wasn't worried about that. What worried him was the feeling in his gut, the one that told him something wasn't right. The bikers began to fill up their tanks, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Forge's gaze drifted toward a small diner across the street. A couple of trucks were parked outside, and the occasional car drove by. But as he stared, something caught his attention, a figure standing just inside the diner window, watching them. Forge's instincts kicked in. It was hard to make out at first, but the man's posture was stiff, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for them, maybe. Forge's hand instinctively reached for the handle of his bike, his mind racing. Could this be the uncle's men? Were they already onto them? He couldn't be sure, but he didn't like it. He turned to Rick, who was filling up his tank, and nodded toward the diner. "Keep an eye on that window," Forge said quietly. Rick looked up, his eyes narrowing as he followed Forge's gaze. "Got it," he said, his voice low and steady. Forge moved toward the back of the gas station, his eyes never leaving the diner. He needed to figure out if they were being watched, and, if so, how they could get out without drawing attention. The last thing they needed was a confrontation in a small town. As the bikers finished their refueling, Forge made his way back to the front of the station. The man in the window was gone, but Forge didn't trust the coincidence. It was too quiet, too easy. "All right, listen up," Forge said to the crew as they gathered around. "We've got to stay sharp. This isn't just a pit stop. Someone's been watching us, and I don't think it's just coincidence." The crew nodded, their faces hardening. "We move out as soon as we're done. Stay close and stay quiet." They all knew what that meant. The time for resting was over. The group finished up quickly and mounted their bikes, the engines rumbling to life as they prepared to leave the gas station. The tension in the air had thickened, and Forge knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous. The crew started rolling out, keeping close formation as they headed out of the small town, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. As they turned onto a larger highway, the unease grew stronger. The road ahead stretched into the distance, but something was off. Forge's gut told him that the town wasn't the only place they needed to be worried about. The uncle had to know they were close, and there was something about the figure in the window that didn't sit right with him. Forge glanced over his shoulder at Maya, still asleep, but her face tight with the weight of the world. She wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot. The crew had been riding hard for hours, and the fatigue was beginning to show. They needed to get to the next safe house, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Every sound seemed amplified. Every car that passed seemed like it could be a threat. His grip on the handlebars tightened, and he sped up, urging the crew to follow. "We've got to keep moving," Forge said, his voice hard through the helmet. "We can't stop until we get to the safe house." The bikers picked up their pace, the convoy surging forward, the roar of the engines growing louder as they pushed on. The road was empty now, but Forge knew it wouldn't stay that way. The uncle's men could be anywhere, watching, waiting, and he wouldn't stop until they had taken back control of their own lives. Maya was going to be safe. They would make sure of it. The convoy of bikers roared down the highway, their speed picking up as they pushed toward the next safe house. Forge was at the front, his focus sharp. Every muscle in his body was on high alert, feeling the weight of their mission. The night had fallen, casting long shadows across the road, and the low hum of the bikes seemed to amplify the stillness. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind kept drifting back to the figure in the diner, the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. It was clear they were being watched. What started as a brief stop for fuel had turned into something much more dangerous. Now they were racing against time, with Maya's uncle still somewhere out there, with his eyes set on her. Forge had no doubts that they were closing in on them. His grip on the handlebars tightened. They had to get to the safe house and lay low, but the road was long and their enemy was patient. Maya, still riding behind him, was silent, her small body clinging to him with a quiet desperation that only deepened his resolve. She had been through too much already. Forge would make sure that she wasn't going through it alone any longer. But deep down, he knew that even with all his protection, even with the crew watching their backs, there was no guarantee of safety. The closer they got to the safe house, the more exposed they became. The further they rode, the more Forge realized that they could be walking into a trap. They had no idea how many were following them or if the uncle had brought backup. The plan had been simple at first: move quickly, stay ahead, find a place to regroup. But now, as the night dragged on and the darkness thickened, Forge wasn't so sure. They could keep running, but sooner or later, they would have to face whatever was chasing them. He glanced at Rick, who had been riding steadily behind them, his face tight with anxiety. Rick had been through hell, watching his own family fall apart and having to make tough decisions in a split second. Now, he was part of this fight, whether he liked it or not. They weren't just saving Maya anymore. They were fighting for survival. Forge knew Rick felt the weight of that. "We're almost there," Forge said to him, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Rick or to himself. Rick gave a stiff nod, not trusting his voice. Forge didn't push him. There was no point in saying more. They were all thinking the same thing. They needed to stay sharp, stay vigilant. They couldn't afford any mistakes. A few miles ahead, Forge saw the dim glow of lights. The town they were approaching was small, but it was close to the safe house. They had to make it through this stretch of road without drawing attention. As they neared the outskirts of town, Forge's instincts kicked in. He signaled to the others to slow down, the bikes falling into a tight formation. The small town was quiet, almost too quiet. The sound of their engines seemed louder than usual, echoing through the streets. Forge felt his pulse quicken. The closer they got to the safe house, the closer they were to danger. He scanned the buildings along the street, his mind running through every possible scenario. They needed to make it through the next few minutes without drawing any suspicion. The bikes rolled through the town, their headlights cutting through the night. Forge's eyes locked onto a shadow moving by a street corner. A figure stood motionless in the dark, just out of sight. Forge's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was the uncle's men, or if it was someone else, but he knew it wasn't good. "Stay sharp," Forge muttered under his breath. He motioned for the crew to move faster, urging the bikes ahead. The convoy picked up speed, engines roaring louder as they made their way through the town. The figure on the corner didn't move. Forge didn't take any chances. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He felt the pull of danger in the air, but he couldn't stop. The safe house was only a few miles away. They had to make it. They had to get there before anything went wrong. The road opened up again, and the bikers picked up speed, racing toward the woods that surrounded the safe house. Forge's thoughts raced even faster. They were so close, but so was danger. The night was alive with the sound of their engines and the wind, a brief moment of calm before the storm. The lights of the safe house appeared ahead, but Forge's instincts told him not to trust it. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. There was no such thing as safety anymore. Not for them. Not for Maya. As they reached the gates of the safe house, the last of the crew pulled up behind him, and Forge dismounted his bike, eyes scanning the area. They were here. But now, the real fight was about to begin. They were in enemy territory, and it was only a matter of time before they were found. "Get inside," Forge ordered the crew, his voice low but firm. "We're not letting our guard down. Not yet." Maya was still asleep, but Forge knew that it wouldn't be long before everything changed. The time to rest was over. The war had only just begun. The sound of engines roaring faded as the convoy pulled into the safe house, the familiar hum of their bikes replaced by the unsettling quiet of the woods around them. Forge dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a firm thud, his senses immediately on high alert. The air felt thick with tension, and his eyes scanned the surroundings. Everything had to be perfect. He motioned for the crew to follow him inside, but the unease didn't leave his chest. The safe house was supposed to be a refuge, a place to regroup, but Forge knew better. There was no such thing as safe anymore, not for them, not with Maya still a target. The crew moved quickly, securing the perimeter and making sure the doors and windows were locked. The quiet hum of the nearby forest did nothing to ease the growing sense of impending danger. Maya, still holding onto the sliver of peace she had found earlier, was now awake and sitting on the worn couch inside the cabin. Her eyes were wide, and Forge could see the weight of fear still clinging to her. Small frame. She had been through too much already. and Forge could only imagine what was going through her mind. He walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. She nodded slowly, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Forge felt a pang in his chest. "I know you are, kid," he said, reaching out to gently pat her shoulder. "But you're not alone. We've got you, and we're not going anywhere until you're safe." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the fear seemed to ease. But Forge knew the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Stay here, Maya," Forge said, standing up and turning to the rest of the crew. "We've got work to do." The bikers gathered in the next room, where Forge outlined their plan. "We need to move fast," Forge began, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "The uncle won't give up. He's going to come looking for her, and we need to be ready." One of the bikers, Diesel, nodded. "We'll set up watch," he said. "But we also need to get some more intel. If his people are looking for us, we need to know who we're dealing with." "Agreed," Forge replied. "We can't just hide out here. We need to find out who else is involved, and why they're after Maya." They spent the next few hours preparing, securing the house, and setting up lookout points. Forge assigned shifts to each of the bikers, making sure someone was always on guard. The rest of the crew set up equipment, checking weapons and radios. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He felt eyes on them even as he checked the perimeter again. His instincts were always sharp, but tonight, something felt different. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the cabin, Forge gathered the crew outside for one final meeting before nightfall. "We need to figure out how to draw them out," he said, his gaze hardening. "The uncle isn't working alone. He's part of something bigger. We need to find the source." The group was quiet, the weight of Forge's words sinking in. This wasn't just about protecting Maya anymore. It was about uncovering the truth behind all of this, about taking down the people responsible for the destruction of so many lives. "We keep our eyes and ears open," Forge continued. "We can't be caught off guard. We'll use the night to our advantage. I'm not going to let them get to her." Diesel stepped forward. "We'll stay alert. If anyone comes, we'll handle it." Forge nodded, his jaw tight. He trusted his crew, but tonight, trust wasn't enough. They needed to be more than just ready. They needed to be proactive. "I'm going out tonight," Forge said, his voice firm. "I'm going to get answers." The crew exchanged glances, but didn't question him. They knew Forge wasn't the kind of man who sat back when there was a fight to be had. "I'm coming with you," Rick said, stepping forward. Forge shook his head. "No, you stay with Maya. She needs you." Rick hesitated, but didn't argue. "All right, but be careful." Forge turned and motioned for Diesel to follow him. "Let's get moving," Forge said, his tone serious. They slipped out of the cabin quietly, the night air cool against their skin. The woods were dark, but Forge knew the terrain well. He'd spent years riding through places like this, learning the landscape like the back of his hand. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. But Forge's focus remained sharp. Every step, every movement, felt like it could be the one that made all the difference. They made their way to a clearing about a mile from the cabin, where they set up a temporary stakeout point. Forge's thoughts raced as he looked around, trying to put the pieces together. Maya's uncle wasn't acting alone, and someone had to be pulling the strings. He couldn't leave things to chance. Not this time. As the night stretched on, Forge and Diesel stayed alert, watching every car that passed, every shadow that moved. But nothing came. No one came. For now, at least, they were safe. But Forge knew that wouldn't last long. The storm was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. The silence of the woods was suffocating as Forge and Diesel kept their eyes on the road. Hours had passed since their quiet surveillance mission began, but still, there was no sign of anyone. The tension was palpable. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the trees, had Forge's heart racing. He was used to being on high alert, but tonight felt different. The calm before the storm. He glanced at Diesel, who stood beside him, just as focused. They hadn't said much, both men knowing that words wouldn't do anything to ease the growing weight on their shoulders. Forge could feel it. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. The safe house, though well hidden, no longer felt safe. Maya was inside, still under their protection, but as the minutes passed, Forge knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The uncle would come for her again. Forge wasn't sure if it was out of desperation or loyalty to her father, but that man had made it clear that he wouldn't stop until he had his hands on her. A sound broke through the stillness, an engine in the distance. Forge's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Diesel shifted next to him, already tensing. It was a car, the headlights barely visible through the trees, but Forge could sense the danger. This wasn't just a passerby. This was something bigger. Forge motioned to Diesel to stay back, keeping his position in the shadows as the vehicle came closer. The engine grew louder as it approached, its tires crunching on the gravel road. Forge's breath caught in his throat as the car pulled into view. It wasn't the uncle's vehicle, but it was too close for comfort. The car slowed and stopped near the edge of the woods. Forge's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't good. They're not stopping by chance, Diesel whispered, his voice low. Forge nodded, his grip tightening around the handle of his weapon. This wasn't the time for hesitation. Someone was out there, and they weren't here to make friends. The door of the car opened, and a tall figure stepped out, scanning the area. Forge's eyes narrowed, recognizing the silhouette instantly. He'd seen this man before, though Forge couldn't place where. The man was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself like he owned the place. Forge didn't need to be told who it was. This wasn't just anyone. It was another one of the uncle's men. This was part of the bigger picture. The man paused, looking toward the safe house, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Forge could feel his pulse quicken. This was the moment. If they didn't act now, they'd be discovered. Forge motioned for Diesel to stay put as he slowly crouched, moving silently through the underbrush. The man was too focused on the cabin, not noticing Forge's movements. Forge's eyes locked onto the man's back, each step calculated, steady. He needed to get closer. Diesel moved in parallel, keeping a careful watch on the surroundings. Forge's muscles tensed as he reached the edge of the clearing, only a few feet away from the man. The moment was closing in. Forge's hand hovered near his gun, ready to draw, but he hesitated. If they could avoid a confrontation, they would. But if the man made one wrong move, Forge wasn't going to hold back. The man turned suddenly, his eyes scanning the area again, as if he sensed something was off. Forge's heart skipped a beat. The man's gaze shifted toward the woods, and for a brief second, Forge froze. But then, just as quickly, the man seemed to dismiss the feeling and turned back toward the cabin. Forge let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That was too close. The man made his way toward the cabin, and Forge knew that if they didn't act soon, the situation would escalate. He waited, keeping a careful eye on the man as he approached the front door. But just before the man reached the door, another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Rick. His face was drawn, his eyes locked onto the man with a sense of urgency. Forge's heart sank as he realized Rick had taken the bait. The man turned, his face lighting up with a smug smile as he recognized Rick. "You're a long way from home," the man said, his voice cold. "You should have stayed out of this, Rick. This doesn't concern you." Rick's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. "I'm not going anywhere without Maya," Rick said, his voice low but determined. Forge could see the tension in Rick's body. He was trying to hold his ground, but Forge knew the situation was getting out of control. Forge stepped forward, his hand on his weapon, ready to intervene if things went sideways. Rick wasn't trained for this kind of fight. Forge was. The man in front of Rick smiled again, a cruel twist of his lips. "Maya's uncle is only one part of the problem, Rick. There's more going on here than you realize." Forge's blood ran cold as the man's words hung in the air. This was bigger than any of them had imagined. Maya's uncle was just the beginning. The man stepped forward, his posture threatening. "If you're smart, you'll stay out of our way," the man warned. Rick didn't flinch, but Forge could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. This wasn't just about saving Maya anymore. This was about something much darker, and Forge knew they had to act fast. The man reached for something inside his jacket, and Forge knew it was time to make a move. Without hesitation, Forge drew his gun, aiming it at the man's chest. "Move away from Rick." Now, the standoff was tense, and Forge's heart pounded in his chest. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled again, that cold, calculated smile. "You think you can stop this? You have no idea what's coming." The words hit Forge like a punch. He wasn't just fighting for Maya now. He was fighting against a force much larger than he had ever imagined. Forge's gun was steady in his hand, aimed directly at the man in front of Rick. The words that the man had spoken echoed in his mind, but Forge wasn't about to let this go any further. The air between them was thick with tension. Rick, standing just a few feet away, hadn't moved, but Forge could see the unease in his eyes. The man's smile remained cold, almost mocking, as he slowly reached into his jacket. Forge's heart pounded. Every instinct in him told him to act fast. The man's fingers brushed against something in his coat, a weapon, Forge assumed, but he wasn't waiting to find out. "Don't make me say it again," Forge said through gritted teeth. "Move away from Rick." The man's smile didn't falter, and for a brief moment, Forge wondered if he was playing a game. But then, the man's eyes narrowed, and he dropped his hand. Forge didn't lower his gun. The standoff seemed to stretch on, the sound of the wind through the trees the only thing breaking the silence. "You don't understand what you're up against," the man said, his voice quiet but menacing. "This isn't just about Maya anymore. It's much bigger than you, Forge. You're walking into something you can't fight." Forge's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't pull it. His mind raced with the man's words. It didn't matter what was bigger. He wasn't backing down now. "Whatever this is, we'll face it head on," Forge said, his voice firm. "But Maya's not going anywhere. Not while I'm breathing." The man looked at him, his eyes calculating, before he slowly raised his hands, palms outward in mock surrender. "You don't even know who you're up against," he repeated, but Forge had heard enough. He wasn't getting distracted. Maya's safety was the only thing that mattered now. "Stay away from Rick, and stay the hell away from her," Forge said. The man stared at him for a long moment, and just as Forge felt like the situation was about to explode, the man turned, his boots crunching against the dirt as he walked toward his car. "This isn't over," the man called back, not even bothering to look over his shoulder. "We'll see you soon enough." With that, the man got into the car, slammed the door shut, and sped off into the night, leaving the dust behind him. Forge didn't lower his weapon until the car was completely out of sight. Even then, his grip didn't loosen. Rick stood silently behind him, his eyes following the car's retreating taillights. "What now?" Rick finally asked, his voice low. Forge didn't answer immediately. He took a moment to let the tension drain from his body. "We move forward," he said, his voice steady. "We keep Maya safe. We stay together. And we get to the bottom of this." He turned to Rick. "I'm not leaving you behind. I'm not leaving her behind. We stick together." Rick nodded, though Forge could see the weariness in his eyes. "I'm with you. Just tell me what to do." Forge motioned for him to follow. "We get back to the safe house. We don't stop until we're there." As they made their way back, Forge's thoughts kept returning to the man's words. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But whatever was coming, Forge knew they had no choice but to face it. The only way out was through. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than just Maya's uncle was in play, but that didn't matter. Maya was safe for now, and that's what kept him going. As they reached the cabin, the crew was already back inside, waiting. Diesel, who had been on lookout, stepped forward. "Everything clear?" Forge asked. Diesel nodded. "For now, but I still don't trust it. We've got to stay ready." Forge didn't disagree. He glanced at Maya, who was sitting by the window, her eyes watching the night outside. She was quiet, her small figure drawn in on itself, but for the first time in days, she looked like she was starting to relax. Forge knew it was temporary. As long as her uncle, and whatever else was coming, was out there, they couldn't afford to get comfortable. The bikers had prepared for this kind of situation. They knew the rules. Keep moving, stay alert, and fight for the ones who couldn't protect themselves. Forge had made a promise to Maya's father, and he intended to keep it. They'd been through hell together, but they were still standing. The weight of what was coming wasn't lost on Forge. But for now, he had his family. And that meant everything. "We keep our heads down for the night," Forge said, his voice calm but firm. "Tomorrow, we move out. We don't stop until we get answers." The crew nodded in unison. They had been through enough to know that Forge's instincts were sharp. They trusted him, and they trusted each other. "We'll get through this," Diesel said, looking around at the group. Forge gave a single nod in response, his eyes moving over everyone. "We will. Together." The sound of engines starting echoed into the quiet night as the crew got to work securing the area. The calm was deceptive, but for now, they had a brief reprieve. Forge stayed by the window for a while longer, his eyes fixed on the distance. He knew this wasn't over. But no matter what came next, they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. Ignite your imagination with an intense ride through the world of Hell Angel stories, where loyalty, danger, and survival collide. This gripping tale explores the lives of a group of bikers protecting a young girl from an impending threat. As they journey through treacherous paths, the bikers face confrontations with ruthless enemies and uncover secrets that go beyond what they had imagined. These Hell Angel stories bring to life the fierce determination of those who would sacrifice everything to keep their promises and protect the innocent. Follow the bikers on their mission to uncover the truth and face down dangerous enemies that lurk in the shadows. With suspenseful moments and intense showdowns, this collection of Hell Angel stories shows the power of camaraderie and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. From the first encounter with the villainous forces to the ultimate fight for survival, these Hell Angel stories will keep you at the edge of your seat, captivated by every twist and turn. Explore the complex web of betrayal, loyalty, and the battle for freedom, as these bikers fight not just for survival, but for justice. If you love Hell Angel stories that mix action, heart, and unexpected revelations, this is a ride you don't want to miss.